What's up, everybody? In this basement bathroom addition video, I'm going to show you how to add a bathroom to a basement from start to finish. The first couple minutes of this video is going to be a time lapse of the entire basement bathroom addition process, and if what you see in the time lapse looks good to you and it's something that you might want to do in your basement, you can watch the entire video, which is going to have each project that you saw in the time lapse broken down in detail so that you can complete a similar renovation. I'm going to have timestamps down below so you can skip around to specific projects, but with that said, let's get into it. Hey everybody, I wanted to let you know that I have a free ebook down below that has all of the materials used in this bathroom as well as a cost breakdown, so feel free to download that if you're interested. If this video is helping you out, I really would appreciate if you could drop a like down below. It really helps me out with the YouTube algorithm, and consider subscribing if you like this type of DIY content. Thanks. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like down below. It helps me out with the algorithm. And subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell if you like this type of DIY content. Finally, as a reminder, I have a free ebook down below that has every material that I installed in this bathroom listed, and also gives you a cost breakdown so you know how much to budget for your basement bathroom addition. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to seeing y'all on the next one. Thanks. So just like with any project, you're going to need to spend a lot of time thinking and planning out your bathroom addition to your basement before you can actually make it happen. First, you want to think about where your actual sewer stack is and where you're going to connect the plumbing to the main sewer stack. And you also want to think about if you're going to be able to do it below grade, or if you're going to need some kind of pumping system to pump the sewage up to a higher elevation where it can drain into the sanitary sewer. So after identifying my sewer stack, I started by marking the general outline for where I wanted to put the bathroom by using some tape on the floor just to get an idea of where everything was going to be placed. Here's what I was thinking. So here's a quick tour before we get started. So the idea is we'll put a barn door right here that'll open up that way, and then you'll walk into the bathroom like this. If we turn to our right, this is where we're going to put our sink and vanity. And then we'll have a partition wall that goes here and also on this side. And then once we have that partition wall, we'll put the toilet right there. And then this area here marked off with tape will be where we put the shower. So in terms of planning out the plumbing, we're going to have the drain there for the sink, we're going to have the drain for the shower / tub, and then we're going to have the drain for the toilet, which is all going to go back to this main cast iron sewer stack, which we're going to swap out with some PVC once we actually replace everything. So once we have an idea of what we're trying to do, it's time to pull out the graph paper and sketch up an actual plan with dimensions of what this bathroom is going to look like. When developing your plan and sketches for your bathroom layout, you need to do some research to figure out the local code requirements, for example, like spacing in front of the toilet and also minimum spacing to the sides of the toilet. And there's also convention for the rough-in distance from the wall to kind of your plumbing drain. So you're going to need to spend some time either meeting with a plumber or just researching local codes to figure out how you want to sketch it up and plan your layout. And typically you're going to need to take these plans and submit them to your city or county for review in order to get permits. Typically for a basement bathroom, you're going to need a building permit, a plumbing permit, an electrical permit, kind of at minimum. The building permit you can usually take care of as the homeowner, but you're going to need a licensed electrician and a licensed plumber to sign off on your plumbing and electrical permit. For the plumbing, I was able to find a plumber which I hired to do the under slab plumbing just because at the time I didn't have a jackhammer, and he was able to sign off on all of the other rough-in plumbing that I did that was above the slab. And for the electrician, I was able to make contact with someone who was going to let me run all the electrical, and then they would come back in later on, check it, make sure it was up to code and done correctly, and then they would sign off on it. So the whole permitting process, I don't like to get into in a lot of detail because it does vary a lot from city to city. But in my ebook, I have a little bit more information on the permitting process. But your best bet is just to get on the phone with your city or county and ask them what you're going to need to submit in order to get your basement bathroom approved. So after submitting my plans to the city and addressing any comments that they had just in terms of moving things around or increasing spacing, I hired my plumber and he got to work demolishing the slab and installing the under slab plumbing. Now, I typically don't outsource stuff like this, but at the time I didn't own a jackhammer and I figured it would be worth paying the $1,500 to $2,000 for a professional licensed plumber to deal with all that dust, all that demolition, and because it's underneath the concrete slab of my house, I didn't want to make a mistake, and I figured having someone who knew what they were doing do it would be worth the money. I don't do this often, but for something like this, I thought it was worth it. So as you can see here, they're laying out the rough plan for the toilet drain and the tub drain. Here's a look at the cast iron pipe that was removed. And at this point, they were digging down deep so they could make the connection to that sewer stack that goes out to the street. And fortunately, from a cost perspective, our sewer pipe was deep enough where we didn't need a sewage pump. And then they installed this check valve which limits flow to going out towards the street and eliminates the possibility of backflow coming up into the house. After the plumber had all of the piping and valves installed for the under slab plumbing, he mixed up some cement and applied it, and the idea is he'd add enough cement where it would be level with the existing finished floor concrete on both sides. After the contractor backfilled around the plumbing with concrete, here's what we looked like preliminarily, and now I'm going to give you a quick narration from what I was observing in the field. Okay, so at this point we replaced the cast iron with the PVC all the way down. You see we have a clean out right there, and then we have the check valve for our washer and dryer. Right there is the backflow preventer valve that just prevents any backups in the sewer from coming back into the house. And that line goes here. I'm gonna switch around real quick. So right here's the bathroom. Right there is going to be where the toilet goes. That's the stub for that. Right here, you can see that we have a Y. This right here makes its way to that area, which is going to be where the sink and vanity goes. And then here is where we'll connect to the tub. So from the other angle, we have the backflow preventer valve. We have our toilet stub. We have our stub for the tub that's gonna go in right there, the tub drain. And then we have our connection here to the vanity and sink. And before the plumber finalized the below slab plumbing for the tub, he wanted me to frame the back wall and position the tub in place so that he knew exactly where the drain was going to be. And as you can see, he went back and he did some additional concrete around that area. Here's what it looks like, and then here's what it looks like after I actually built that wall towards the end. As you can see, he never actually filled in that last little bit with concrete. Before I wrap up this video, I want to talk a little bit about basement waterproofing, because as you saw when the plumber was demolishing around that sanitary pipe, there was a perforated pipe that was kind of snaking around it, and what that's called is interior drain tiles. It's a perforated pipe that's going to collect any water that makes its way down around the foundation, and it's going to route it to a sump pump, which is then going to pump it up and out of the house. That's what I have in my basement for waterproofing, but there's also something called an exterior French drain, which is a similar concept with a perforated pipe on the exterior of the home, and that's going to collect water near the foundation and route it to a distance that's safely away from your foundation. Basement waterproofing is very important, so make sure that you take care of it before you add a bathroom. In this basement bathroom framing video, I'm going to show you everything you need to know about framing walls in your basement bathroom. This is going to include framing a 16-inch on-center wall, how to frame around support beams or columns in the basement, and also some tips and tricks for how to frame around things like pipes or HVAC. So if that sounds good to you, let's get right into the video. So before we can actually frame the walls, we need to have an idea of the layout for our bathroom. So here's what I'm thinking. So here's a quick tour before we get started. So the idea is we'll put a barn door right here that'll open up that way. And then you'll walk into the bathroom like this. If we turn to our right, this is where we're gonna put our sink and vanity. And then we'll have a partition wall that goes here and also on this side. And then once we have that partition wall, we'll put the toilet right there. And then this area here marked off with tape will be where we put the shower. I have more info on layout in my ebook and also my video, and I'll link that down below, but I do recommend that you put some tape down to kind of establish the layout for the walls. And I don't mean to insult your intelligence here, but obviously the basement plumbing in the slab should go in before the walls. Okay, now let's actually get into the framing. Now, when framing a basement wall, you're gonna have the top plate, the bottom plate, and your wall studs, and those wall studs are typically gonna be placed 16 inches on center. The bottom plate is going to be in contact with your concrete slab, so that needs to be pressure treated, and the top plate can be standard kiln dried lumber. Now, something else I want to mention is the double top plate. If you're building something structural like a shed or new construction house, you want to have the double top plate on top, which provides extra rigidity, and it also ties the walls together. But in a basement bathroom like this, where the walls are really just for the shape of the room and to hang drywall, we don't need a double top plate for this application. The first step in framing walls is to measure the wall height, which is the distance between the floor slab and the joists above. Measure in a few locations, and the shortest measurement is what you want to frame your walls to. So now that we know the height of the wall and hopefully how long the wall is going to be based on our layout, you can go ahead and cut your top and bottom plate to length and then cut your studs to the right height. Now keep in mind that the total wall height is going to consist of the stud and then the 1.5 inch bottom plate and the 1.5 inch top plate. So when you cut your studs, make sure that you account for that extra 3 inches that's going to come from the top and bottom plate, since a 2x4 has a nominal thickness of around 1.5 inches. After cutting your studs to length, you want to take your top plate and bottom plate, and I recommend that you run the tape measure along, marking 16 inches on center all the way across. And because the studs are 1.5 inches, I usually mark 15 1/4 and 16 3/4 on the top and bottom plate, so I can position the stud right in between the lines. Now it's time to position the top plate, the bottom plate, and the studs, and one thing you want to do is you want to crown all of your studs, and the crown of the board is just the slight curvature that you're going to see when sighting down the long edge of a 2x4. Typically, I'll use a framing nailer and 3.5 inch nails to go through the top and bottom plate and into the studs. And for simple walls like this, that's pretty much all there is to it. Take the bottom plate, which is pressure treated, the top plate, position the outermost studs in place and nail them in using a framing nailer, and then position the intermediate studs 16 inches on center in between. After nailing the wall together, position it in place, aligning the bottom plate along the slab where you want it and making sure that the wall is plumb using a 6-foot level. Also, highly recommend these tinted safety glasses inside. So after positioning the wall in place, it's time to attach the bottom plate to the concrete. There's a few different methods for doing this. For my basement bathroom, I used a carbide tip masonry bit to pre-drill through the bottom plate and into the concrete. And then I used a Tapcon screw, which is meant for concrete, to go down through the bottom plate and into the slab. Now, although I anchored all of my bottom plates to the slab using a carbide tip masonry bit to pre-drill and Tapcon screws, you can also use a powder actuated tool, which is going to use gunpowder to essentially launch a nail through your bottom plate and secure it into the slab. I didn't have one of these, but it would have been a lot faster. After attaching the bottom plate, confirm one more time that your wall is plumb, insert shims as needed, and then use your framing nailer to attach the top plate to the ceiling joists above. Now, pretty much anytime you're framing in a basement or a basement bathroom, you're gonna have some kind of header or a support column that you're gonna need to frame around. Let me show you how I did that in my basement bathroom. All right, so the next thing we have to do is we gotta frame around the support beam and this column here. So obviously, this is gonna be a little bit wider than your standard 2x4. So I'm gonna rip down some 2x6s and then just rip them down to the same width. And then we're gonna frame around this guy so we can put the vanity there. So as you saw, that header had a width of around 5 inches. So I'm gonna take this 2x6 board, use clamps and another board as a straight edge, and I'm gonna rip it down with a circular saw to around 5 inches so that it matches the width of the header. And just like our 2x4 walls, we're gonna position the studs and the top plate and bottom plate in place, just using 2x6 lumber that we ripped down to 5 inches. And after nailing everything together, I picked up the wall, positioned it in place, and I had to use a hammer here because it was a pretty snug fit to actually get it level and plumb. Then I repeated the same process for the smaller section of wall, which is going to go on the left-hand side of that support column. Then I did some final checks for plumb, and then I confirmed the width to make sure my vanity would fit. All right, so at this point, we have our wall in place. Got it all squared up around that column. And obviously with any wall, you want to make sure that you're level at every single one of these, both this way, make sure you're level this way. So the next thing we gotta do is anchor this to the concrete. So I have a hammer drill right here with a carbide tip bit. We got a Tapcon screw, And after getting that wall installed, I positioned the tub in place so I could see where I needed to position the back wall. Okay, so before the plumber can actually set the tub, what he asked me to do, this is where the tub's going right here, he asked me to go ahead and frame in this back wall. So as you can see, I already framed in the front wall, and then these tubs are 5 feet long typically, so that's obviously 5 times 12 puts us right at 60 inches. So from there to here, I measured out just a hair over 5 feet for this wall. And then what I'm gonna do is I transpose those marks there. I'm gonna go ahead and put my joist right there and then stick frame in between. Now, for some reason on this back wall, I decided to install the bottom plate first, and then I installed the top plate directly to the ceiling joist, making sure that it was directly above the bottom plate. Then I made my measurements and I cut all of my studs to length individually, made sure they were plumb, and then I toe nailed them in using a framing nailer. I have no idea why I chose to frame this back wall like this, but at the end of the day, it worked out. Again, be sure that you crown your boards and make sure the crown is facing the same direction for all studs. Here I have the 2 walls intersecting, and to create a backing for the drywall, I installed these pieces of blocking, as you can see at the bottom there, and then about every 18 inches or so up. But a better method for this is something called a California corner. So if we remove the top plate, you can see that we're gonna go ahead and have a typical stud in the corner that you're always gonna have, but you're also gonna turn one stud sideways and mount it to the inside face of the other stud. This will accomplish 2 purposes. 1, it's gonna allow you to insulate better, and 2, it's gonna give you a backing for the drywall or gypsum board you're gonna be installing later on. Also, you might find yourself in a position where you need to add an additional stud or blocking to actually attach something like this fiberglass tub insert to solid backing like a stud. So if you need to add one in later, it's no big deal. Just position it in place and then toe nail it in to the top and bottom plate. And if you have any doorways like I did for my bathroom, you're gonna cut out the bottom plate through the entryway using a Sawzall. Because we're working in a basement, there's a high likelihood that you're gonna have pipes or HVAC ducts that you're gonna need to frame around. To frame around these in my basement bathroom, I used an OSB and kind of ledger board system. And for this method, you're gonna attach a hanger board, a piece of OSB, and then another board at the bottom. I think this is the easiest method. It's maybe not the most cost effective, but I have a dedicated video on my channel showing how to do that, which I'll link down below. Also, I'm not really gonna get into the drywall aspect of this basement bathroom. I have a tips and tricks video on drywall that I performed for my basement renovation, which I'll also link down below. In this video, I'm going to show you how to apply a self-leveling concrete underlayment over a concrete floor, and this video is going to cover everything from surface prep to primer application to actually applying the self-leveling concrete, and we're going to do it in under 3 minutes. Here's a look at the uneven concrete floor in my basement where we're going to be applying the self-leveling concrete. And my basement started out relatively level, but as part of my basement bathroom addition, the plumbers came in, they demoed the slab to install the plumbing, and although they did their best to repair it with concrete, as you can see, it's looking a little bit uneven and wonky. So we're definitely gonna have to apply some self-leveling concrete before we can install our LVP flooring. So the first step is basically you want to vacuum or sweep up any dirt or debris. You want to have a clean substrate, and I'm also taking a paper towel that I dampened with some water just to clean up any dust. After removing dust, we're going to prime the surface, and because I'm using Level Quick self-leveling concrete, I'm using the Level Quick primer, which you need to dilute 3 parts of water to 1 part of primer. I perform my 3 parts to 1 part dilution in a Chinese food carryout container, which seems to be the most appropriate, and then I used a nap roller to apply the primer to my uneven concrete subfloor. You want to apply a thin uniform layer, so make sure you go back and remove any of the puddles. So after applying the primer, you want to let it dry for around 1 to 3 hours just so it dries to a clear film. And once it's dry, it's finally time to apply the self-leveling concrete underlayment. As mentioned previously, I'm using Level Quick RS for this, and if you're mixing the whole 50-pound bag, you're going to add around 5.5 quarts of cool water, add in the self-leveling concrete mix, and then you're going to mix it up to kind of a pancake batter consistency using a drill with a mixer attachment. This self-leveling concrete mix calls for 2 minutes of mixing, but follow the manufacturer's instructions for the product you're using. To apply the self-leveling concrete underlayment product, you're really just going to dump it over the application area. Less is more because you can always go back and add more later. But this product is, as the name suggests, self-leveling. So over the first 15 or 20 minutes, the product is going to seek its own level, and you can add more if there's any low spots. And the manufacturer calls for the use of kind of a concrete trowel, or I'm using a drywall knife here, which is not ideal, but you can kind of help to coax the product into any areas that it's a little bit reluctant to actually travel to. You can apply this product up to 1.5 inches all the way down to a feathered edge. This product will dry to a walkable hardness within 2 to 4 hours, and I recommend after the product sets up a little bit, grabbing a wet sponge to really smooth out that feathered edge. Unfortunately, I don't have too many photos of the finished product, but after giving it a couple days to dry, I went back and applied my LVP flooring over the new flat concrete surface. You can also apply this self-leveling concrete over OSB or plywood, but there's a few additional steps, so I'll link the manufacturer's instructions down below. And after installing the LVP, I installed a toilet, and I'll cover all of these other projects in my next couple videos. My name's Andrew, and in this video, I'm going to show you how I installed luxury vinyl plank flooring in my basement bathroom, taking it from this sad original slab, sad situation, I know, and turning it into this. So if you're looking to install LVP in your basement or basement bathroom, I recommend you watch this whole video. So before I installed LVP in my basement bathroom, I installed LVP throughout my entire basement, and I have a detailed video that goes through that process that I'll link below. I think you'll find it helpful, and it's probably a good video to watch to kind of supplement this one. Additionally, I have a blog that you can check out that goes through even more information on installing LVP. Before you can install LVP, you need to make sure that your concrete slab is perfectly flat, and although this area of my basement was initially pretty flat, after the plumbers went in and put in the under slab plumbing, it was very far from flat. So I had to apply something called a self-leveling underlayment, which is basically this thin topping of concrete, which is going to help to level out your floor. For Metro Floors LVP, which is what I'm installing, I need to make sure that the floor is flat within 3/16 of an inch over a 10-foot radius. So I'll link a video down below showing how I installed this self-leveling concrete underlayment in case you need to level your basement floor. And the last thing we need to talk about before installing LVP is basement waterproofing. You need to make sure there's no moisture in your basement before you install LVP. In my basement, I had to install a system called interior drain tiles, which collects water at the base of the foundation, routes it over to a sump pump, and then pumps it out of the house. Another common waterproofing method is something called an exterior French drain, but these are two of the most common methods for waterproofing a basement. Make sure that you handle any water issues before you install something like LVP. Now, before we lay the LVP, you want to sweep up any dirt or debris. Vacuuming is also a good idea. And then I collected any dust with a mop. And because LVP is a floating floor, you want to allow for a little bit of space for the floor to expand and contract with changing temperatures. So put some spacers around the room. 1/4 of an inch is fine. So typically you're going to start your LVP installation in the back left corner of the room, which is what I did for my basement. But because this is a continuation in my bathroom, I'm actually going to connect from one room to another. And I'm going to start my LVP installation in the bathroom with a molding. Because these floors are the same on both sides, a T-molding is what we're going to install here. So as you can see here, I completed the LVP installation in the adjacent room, and then I ripped some of the width of this first piece out so that I could put the next piece in place and have it interlock properly. And then we have the track positioned between the two rooms, and we're going to install that T-molding over top. So these moldings are typically going to come with a track that's made of metal that I'm cutting here with my miter saw. And then here's the actual T-molding, which I'm going to measure and then cut to size. To anchor the transition molding track, you're going to mark the screw penetrations and you're going to drill down using a carbide tip masonry bit into the concrete floor, vacuum out any dirt or debris, then put the inserts in place, position the track over top, and then you're going to screw the track to the floor below. You can also add some construction adhesive for additional hold. Then take the T-molding, snap it into place, and use a hammer to tap it in so it interlocks properly. So with the T-molding transitioning between the two rooms, you can see on the right-hand side, I had to use a jigsaw to cut out that notch around the wall, and I ripped down that first board so that it would be a perfect width so that I wouldn't need to notch out the other side. So instead of trying to show you how to install LVP in this narrow, dark bathroom, let's go back out to the other room and I'll show you actually how to install LVP. As mentioned, you want to start in the back left corner of the room as indicated by the number 1 tile there, and you want to have a 6-inch minimum stagger between tiles and also on the end of the room. Also, you want to avoid having a small sliver at the end, so if you measure and there's going to be a small sliver, you're going to want to cut a little bit off both sides so that it's kind of split between the front and back of the room. For my basement bathroom, I'm using Metro Floors Engage Inception LVP, which is waterproof and has an underlayment attached to the backside, which I think is well worth the money. I had to install underlayment separately for another project, and it was not fun. LVP is manufactured with a groove edge and a tongue edge. The tongue edge is going to be positioned towards the starting wall, and the groove edge is going to be towards the middle of the room. To interlock two tiles, insert the tongue into the groove and it forms a nice watertight seal. When installing the adjacent tile, insert the tongue into the groove and then slide it over so that the short edge of the tongue rests inside the groove of the board installed previously, and use a mallet to secure the boards together. And for every single LVP installation, you're going to need to learn how to cut the boards. To cut LVP, I recommend that you transpose the measurement onto the face of the LVP and then use a carpenter square and a utility knife to score the face of the LVP. Then flip the board over, snap it along the scored lines, and use a utility knife to cut through the underlayment on the bottom. This is the best way to cut LVP, at least according to me. Now that we know how to actually install LVP, let's move back into the bathroom, and as you can see here, I'm inserting the tongue edge into the groove edge of the row that was installed previously, and I had to notch around that wall using a jigsaw. I recommend that you mark cuts like that using a carpenter square and a Sharpie, and then a jigsaw is the best way I found to cut those boards out. Over on the left-hand side, I want to make sure that it's a clean, even line between the boards because I'm going to install a piece of molding there in a minute, and once everything looked even, I used the mallet to secure the short edges together. Additionally, as part of the LVP installation kit I got on Amazon, there's a tapping block that you can use to make sure the boards are interlocked perfectly. Now at this location, I'm going to be installing an accordion door to separate the furnace from the rest of the bathroom, so I'm measuring the threshold length here for the reducer molding that we're going to install to transition from the LVP to the concrete slab on the other side. Now that we have the length, we're going to cut the molding track just like we cut the molding track for the team molding that got this project started. Then you're simply going to measure and cut your reducer molding to the correct length. Position the track in place and secure it to the slab just like we did for the team molding, then snap the reducer molding in place, which gives us a nice clean transition between the slab and the LVP flooring on the edge. Here's a look at the accordion door I installed in between the bathroom and the furnace, and I have a dedicated video on the installation of this accordion door. I'll link it down below. At this point, we're in the narrow quarter of the bathroom between the wall and the tub, and I could have staggered the joints here, but I got a little bit lazy and just did straight full boards. Here's a look from the other angle showing how I'm taking the tongue edge of this next board, inserting it into the groove edge of the board previously installed, and then snapping it in place. Now, the next LVP board we install is going to go over top of this toilet pipe here, which is eventually going to be our toilet flange. So I made a few measurements to determine where that pipe was going to actually intersect with the board, and then I found this roll of mesh tape to be a pretty similar circumference to the actual pipe, so I used it as a template to mark the cutout penetration. A Sharpie was better for this since you can see it better when you make the cut. To cut out this circular penetration, I first drilled a hole through the center, then I used a jigsaw to go through that center hole, and then I cut around the circumference of the penetration. This wasn't a perfect cut, but the toilet's gonna cover it up anyways. After making the cut, I positioned it in place. It turned out to fit pretty nicely, and then I inserted the tongue edge into the groove and locked it in place. Because the last piece of LVP was a bit narrower than a full width board, I was gonna have to rip it down. And to do that, I measured the distance between the last piece installed and the wall, then I transposed that width onto a new piece of LVP that I then ripped down to size using a circular saw. After ripping the board to length, I went back and vacuumed up any dirt or debris that might have accumulated in that last spot, and then I positioned the final board in place, interlocked the tongue with the groove, and then I used a pull bar, which came with my Amazon LVP installation kit, to pull it in place, making sure that it was interlocked properly. Then to close out this LVP installation, I found the studs using a stud finder, attached the base boards to the studs, and then I caulked the seam between the LVP and the tub. At this point, the LVP installation in my basement bathroom is done. Let's take a quick reminder look at where we started, and here's a look at the final result. In the next couple of videos, we're going to be installing the drop ceiling and installing the toilet, so if you want to see the rest of those videos, subscribe, drop a like down below to help me out with the algorithm, and I will see you on the next one. In this video, I'm going to show you how I built this semi-modern barn door, and this video is going to cover everything from building the barn door from scratch, from how to install the hardware, how to actually mount the door on the hardware, and at the end, I'll give you a big final reveal. So if that sounds good, stay tuned, but knock next time. So this is the bathroom opening where we're going to be installing this barn door. I started by measuring and I found that a 32-inch by 80-inch solid core door, which is basically just a big hunk of wood, would serve as the base for this barn door. So I cut a little bit of the height down because it was a little too tall for my application, then I vacuumed up the dust. Next, I marked the midpoint of the door because that's going to establish where we start our chevron pattern. For the veneer on my barn door, I installed a product called Renoboard, which you can basically just cut using a utility knife, but I since found out that that product was discontinued discontinued, so you'll need to find another peel and stick option or just go with some real wood and use a miter saw to cut it. So to create the chevron pattern, I cut a 45-degree angle using a carpenter square and a utility knife to score it. Then I matched the cut end up with that midpoint line and let the other end hang a little bit long. We're going to cut that down later. Then I mirrored this arrangement on the other side. Then I repeated this process over and over again. My package came with a lighter style of board and then a darker style, so I did the lighter first and then I started installing the darker boards. And I'm going to continue with that light dark pattern because I think it's going to give the door a nice contrast. And at this point, I started to lose faith in the adhesive that was attached to the board, so I added a bit of additional construction adhesive, and hopefully this works out. And to complete the initial chevron pattern, I'm just going to continue going back and forth with the light dark panels, adding a little bit of extra construction adhesive as I go. And I wanted to leave a bit of overhang, but anywhere that it was excessive, I just trimmed it off. Now with the initial chevron pattern complete, I need to cut another 45-degree angle, which is going to be the boards that match up with the 45 associated with the chevron. Just like before, I made the cut with a utility knife and a carpenter square, but if you're using actual lumber like a 1x4, you'll have to use a miter saw. And then you would just attach it to this solid core door using construction adhesive and brad nails. There are plenty of different ways to do this. This is just how I did it. And honestly, I hope this holds up. I'm a little bit nervous. So at this point, you get the idea for the front of the door here. Let me roll a time lapse to finish out the front. And I know you're probably wondering about the overhang. I promise I'm going to show you how to take care of that in just a second. After finishing with the front of the door, I flipped it over and I completed the back side, except I didn't do the chevron pattern. I just didn't feel like it. I just did straight boards. Now for the overhang, I just took a utility knife and I ran it along the edge. It cut off pretty easily, and I highly recommend something like this if you're doing peel and stick. If you're using real lumber, you'll obviously have to use a table saw or a circular saw. Speaking of circular saws, I'm going to use this piece of 1x12 PVC board, and I'm going to rip it down to the width of my barn door. This is going to be the casing that goes around the perimeter of the door, and it's going to hide the rough edges. To attach this perimeter board, I use construction adhesive and brad nails. Clamps make it easy to hold the board in place while you nail it. I attached the perimeter board to the first long side, then I moved on to the second long side, applied construction adhesive, and then nailed the board in place. As you can see here, I miter the edges at a 45-degree angle with a miter saw. That way, when I cut the short edge to a 45-degree angle on both sides, it's going to match up perfectly with the 45-degree angle we left on the long side. As you can see here, construction adhesive and brad nails to attach it, and it looks pretty good. Now, there's going to be a small gap between the perimeter boards we just installed and the Reno board product that we applied previously. So to fix this, I masked off around 1/4 of an inch inside of the perimeter boards, and that is going to help to keep the caulk that I fill that gap with from going all over the place. It's going to hopefully make it pretty neat and crisp. I used my finger as needed to spread the caulk around, and then I took some black paint and painted the entire perimeter of the barn door. Then after letting it dry, I removed the tape, but I waited too long to remove the tape. You should remove it when it's still kind of wet. Now let's move inside and talk about hardware. I bought all the hardware individually on Amazon, and this was the track I purchased, which comes in individual segments that you attach together, and then they interlock with this washer here. I believe my track came with 4 individual segments, so I repeated this process 4 times. Next up, I did a bit of measuring to figure out how high I wanted to actually mount that track so that it would work with my door, and then once I established how high I wanted it to be, I took a 6-foot level and I marked it using a pencil. Next, I marked the locations where the lag screws were going to go into the wall, and these locations are going to need to correspond with where your studs are placed. You want these lag screws to be going into a stud and not into drywall. I initially set the lag screw using a hex driver, and then after positioning everything in place, I tightened everything up using a socket wrench. And if you're new to the channel, this is where this bathroom started in my basement, and I always knew I was going to be putting in a barn door, so I put in some headers there so I wouldn't have to worry about finding the stud when I installed the track. If you want to see how I did the rest of the projects in this bathroom, check out my channel. Fast forwarding to where we are now, I installed the remaining lag bolts using a socket wrench and made sure everything was tight and secure. Next, it's time to install the rolling brackets, which are going to hang on the top of the door and ride along the track. I established where I wanted to space those, both from the top of the door and the sides, and then I made the marks using a pencil. Next, I grabbed my drill and I pre-drilled holes through the door at the size recommended by the door manufacturer for the bolts we're going to be installing later. After drilling 2 of the bolt holes for each of the brackets, I positioned it in place, made sure everything was going to line up, and then I went on the underside of the door and I installed the actual threaded piece, which is going to mate with that bolt that we're going to install from the top. Moving back to the top, I took the bolts, inserted them in place, and those are going to thread into the inserts that we just hammered in on the bottom. It was a pretty tight fit. After installing the brackets, it was time to install the actual barn door handle, and again, I purchased everything separately on Amazon because it was cheaper, but you can get everything in one package as well. I positioned the barn door handle in place, and I marked the locations where I'm going to need to pre-drill for the bolts that are going to go through the front of the door and into the bracket on the other side. After pre-drilling, I positioned the washers in place, took my handle, positioned it on top, and then I took the insert that's going to go on the other side of the door, positioned it in place, and then tightened up the hardware. At this point, it's finally time to install the door, so I grabbed it. It's pretty heavy, it's a solid core door as you might imagine, and I positioned the hanging brackets so they would ride along the track that we installed previously. After getting it up on the track, I gave it a bit of a test, being pretty tentative at first just to make sure that it wasn't going to fly off the track. Here's how it should look if everything lines up properly. And once the door was in place, we installed these door stops on the end, which is going to prevent the door from sliding off the track. It also has a spring mechanism to prevent slamming. Finally, I purchased these door guides, which are going to allow the door to move along the ground without getting off track. To install them, it's pretty simple. You're just going to pre-drill into your studs through the baseboard in this case, and then secure it to the wall using 2 screws per guide. After installing the bracket, you're going to take this roller guide and you're going to position it so that it's just wide enough to allow the door to pass through. This is going to make sure that your door stays in alignment along its entire travel path. After getting it adjusted to the proper width, tighten everything down with a wrench. And here's a look at the door traveling within those guides. With the guides installed, this barn door project is complete. Let's take a quick reminder look at where we started. And here's a look at the final result. Alright guys, that's a wrap on this video. If you enjoyed it, please drop a like down below. It really helps me out with the YouTube algorithm. And subscribe if you like DIY content like this. In the next couple videos, we're going to wrap up how I did this bathroom. If that sounds good, I'll see you then. In this video, I'm going to show you how to install an LED bathroom vanity mirror, which was part of my basement bathroom edition. This mirror has a couple cool features, and because I value your time, let's try to knock this out in 3-ish minutes. So here's a look at the LED mirror that I bought on Amazon that we're going to be installing today. I'll link it down below if you want to check it out. But this project starts with the power supply that we ran from the circuit breaker to the bathroom. This is a dedicated 20 amp circuit, which we ran into a GFCI outlet right there. And that's going to jump over to the light switch that will eventually turn on this LED mirror. I cut out the drywall penetrations for the GFCI outlet and the light switch, and then I installed the drywall in place and finished it. During the drywalling process, I took the power supply and just tucked it to the drywall like this. Now let's peel away the drywall and actually talk about the electrical wiring. So we have the incoming power coming from the circuit breaker. That's going to a GFCI outlet, and then a light switch, which is going to control the LED mirror. So after going back and painting the bathroom walls, we're left with this electrical wire coming through the drywall, which is no bueno. Obviously, we need to install an electrical box, and this is an old work electrical box that I then scribed around the wires, and then I'm cutting out very gingerly with a jab saw. Now, if you're wondering about that second cable, that's our power to the downstream exhaust fan and recessed puck lights that we're going to be installing later on. So we have the incoming power feed and then that downstream wire. After I finished cutting out the penetration with the jab saw, I double checked that the power was off, then I took off the wire nuts and I placed the cables through the back of the gang box and then pushed the electrical box into place. Because this is an old work box, they have these flanges on each of the 4 corners where when you tighten it up with a screwdriver, it flanges out and pulls it up tight against the drywall. With the electrical box in place, let's take a look at the LED mirror and how we're actually going to hang this on the wall. So this LED mirror comes with a bracket that we're going to attach to the wall, and then the mirror is going to actually hang on that flange as shown. And at this point, you're going to need to do a little bit of math to determine where you want to mount that bracket, both in terms of height and in terms of centering it between the walls. And after a few minutes of calculating, I found where the ends of the bracket was going to be, and I marked that on the wall, and then I marked a horizontal line for where I actually wanted the height of the bracket. Then I took the bracket, positioned it in place, made sure it was level, and fastened it to the studs on the other side of the wall. Make sure that you use a stud finder to actually find the studs, but I planned ahead and put a piece of blocking in. At this point, it's time to wire up the mirror, so I placed it on the floor so that the wiring would reach the electrical box, and then I hooked up the black to black, which is the hot, the white to white, which is the neutral, and then the green to green, which is the ground. This is a good time to say all electrical work should be done by a licensed electrician, and I had this work double checked by a licensed electrician in my area. After hooking everything up, you're going to tuck the wires back into that receptacle box, and at this point it's time to actually hang the mirror. So I'm lifting it up into place and I'm positioning it so that that bracket on the back side is actually mating with the bracket we installed on the wall. And that's all there is to it. Now, without wasting any time, let's flip the breaker back on and take a look at the final result. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like down below and subscribe to the channel for more DIY content like this. Hey everybody, coming to you live right here from my basement bathroom toilet. But just a few short months ago, none of this was here. So in this video, I'm going to show you step by step how to add a basement bathroom toilet, and that's going to include the under slab plumbing, the supply piping, installing the actual toilet flange on the concrete, installing the toilet, and then a few of the final touches to get us to where we are now. So if that sounds like a royal flush, I'm sorry, I had to do it. Let's get right into step one and cover the toilet plumbing, both the under slab plumbing and the supply piping. Before you can start demolishing your basement slab and installing the under slab plumbing, you need to plan things out. So we're going to put our toilet right there and we're going to run the drain line to our main sewer stack, which is shown right here. I was fortunate because I could just do a gravity drain from the toilet to my main sewer stack, but in some applications you might need to install a sewer pump kit or an upflow toilet, but we're going by gravity here. Now, although I usually do all of my own projects and plumbing myself, and I did a whole bathroom remodel upstairs, for this project, I figured it was worth it just to pay $2,000 to have a plumber come in and do the demolition of the slab and install all of the under slab plumbing. Here's a look at the 3-inch PVC fittings that they placed to establish the layout, and that is where the toilet is going to be placed. So after they removed the cast iron pipe and hooked everything up, they installed a check valve or also a backflow preventer valve to make sure that flow is going out to the street but that it won't come back in. Then after setting the rest of the piping, making sure that they had the required slope, they backfilled the area with concrete. After the contractor backfilled around the plumbing with concrete, here's what we looked like preliminarily, and here is the 3-inch stub up for the toilet flange that we're going to install later. But in the meantime, I went and I framed the rest of the bathroom walls, and because we're installing a 10-inch rough-in toilet, I positioned the back wall 10.5 inches from the center of the pipe, because once we add the 1/2-inch drywall, that'll be 10 inches away from the wall. I have a dedicated video on wall framing, which I'll link down below. Now, as you can see here, where the concrete was backfilled, it was incredibly uneven, so I had to apply a self-leveling underlayment to get the area under the toilet perfectly level. I also have a dedicated video on that, which I'll link down below. Now, as far as the supply piping, the contractor installed 1/2-inch CPVC, which is going to connect to the toilet fill valve. In terms of where to position this, move it 6 inches over and then 7 inches up where you want to position that pipe through the wall. Now at this point in the project, I went back, installed drywall, painted the walls, then I cut off the supply pipe coming into the bathroom at a distance from the wall that would accommodate this angle valve. Obviously, I shut off the water supply to the bathroom first. After cutting the pipe, I deburred any of the rough edges, and then I applied some PVC primer and CPVC glue and pushed the angle valve into place. I like to hold the valve for around 15 to 30 seconds just to make sure that solvent weld is strong. With the initial plumbing out of the way, let's move on to step 2, which is installing the toilet flange. To accomplish this, we're going to need to cut off that 3-inch stub flush with the floor so that we can install this 3-inch closet flange, which is going to be attached to the inside of that pipe. To cut that 3-inch PVC pipe flush with the floor, you have a couple options. One, you could use an oscillating tool. You could also probably use a hacksaw, but I think it would be difficult to get it perfectly flush. So I opted to use a reciprocating saw with a long enough blade where I could bend it so that it would be completely flush with the floor and just scribe and run right across it, as you can see here. Make sure that when you cut off the pipe, it doesn't fall down into the actual drain. That's a joke, guys. After cutting the 3-inch PVC pipe flush with the floor, you're going to deburr it and get rid of any rough edges just like we did before, and now we can prepare to install the closet flange. But before doing that, I installed LVP flooring in my bathroom, and I have a dedicated video for that if you want to check it out. To install the closet flange, I placed it within the pipe to preliminarily mark the locations for the anchor bolts, which are going to go down through the closet flange and into the concrete. Because it's concrete, we need to use Tapcon screws, which are made for concrete. And you're also going to need a carbide tip drill bit and a hammer drill to pre-drill into the concrete. I'll link all of these tools and materials down in the description, but you want to make sure that you mark the depth for your actual drill bit so you don't go too deep. I did that for the first hole and then moved over and repeated that process for the second anchor bolt, which is going to hold that toilet flange in place. After drilling, I removed any dust with a vacuum. Then I immediately started applying the purple primer to the inside of the pipe and also the outside of the closet flange. This purple primer will stain anything, so make sure you put stuff down if you're worried about it dripping. After priming, I applied PVC cement glue to the inside of the pipe and the outside of the closet flange, just like we did for the primer, and then I positioned the flange in place, pushed it down into that 3-inch pipe, and made sure that the pre-drilled holes were in line with the penetrations in the closet flange. Again, hold that in place for like 30 seconds to make sure everything sets up properly. After giving the PVC glue enough time to dry, you're going to take your Tapcon screws and you're going to screw down the flange into place. Make sure that you adjust the torque settings on your drill so you don't over tighten. With the closet flange anchored to the concrete slab, it's time to install our seal. And instead of doing a traditional wax ring, I'm going to install this wax-free toilet seal for this basement bathroom toilet. To install this, you start with the gasket and then you're going to put in the foam seal. Since we're above the finished floor, we only need one seal, but if you're below, they give you a second foam seal ring to fill that gap. But since we don't need it, we're going to take off the seal ring and then we're going to put our Johnny bolts into the closet flange, and then they come with these washers that are going to help to hold them in place. With the Johnny bolts in place, it's time to take our wax-free seal again, and we're going to thread that over the Johnny bolts, and then we're going to put on our foam seal, and at this point, we're ready to install the toilet. To install the toilet, you're going to grab it firmly and then you're going to place it on top of the Johnny bolts, making sure that it goes in on both sides. And you want to make sure that the horn at the bottom of the toilet fits where it should, contacting the wax seal, or in our case, the wax-free seal properly. As you can see here, the Johnny bolts are coming up through the bottom of the toilet, and the toilet should be resting flush on the floor. But if it's not and it's wobbling, chances are the toilet is not sitting where it should on the closet flange and the seal. So you may need to reposition. Once you're confident that the toilet is installed properly, place the washer over the Johnny bolt and tighten it in place using the nuts. Be careful not to over tighten because you could crack the toilet bowl. Also, if your floor is not perfectly level, you may need to install shims either at the front or the back of the toilet to make sure that your toilet is perfectly level and secure in place without wobbling. Once the base of the toilet is installed, it's time to install the tank, and the tank is going to be attached to the base using these 3 gasketed bolts. So we're going to pick up the tank and we're going to position it so that those 3 bolts go through the 3 penetrations on the toilet base. And once each of the 3 bolts is installed properly, we'll go on the underside and we'll tighten those up using a washer and a nut that came with the toilet. And again, be sure not to over tighten because you could crack the bowl. Lastly, make sure that the tank is perfectly level. Okay, we're at the home stretch here. It's time for the finishing touches to finish up this basement bathroom toilet installation. First off, we need to install our supply hose, which is going to connect from the angle valve to the fill valve on the toilet. And you want to flush the line first just to make sure there's no debris in it. Then you're going to hook it up to the bottom side of the toilet, just like so. I'll link this hose down in the description. Next up, if your Johnny bolts are a little bit too long, you need to cut them down, and I recommend a hacksaw or you can use a sawzall. Just be careful not to damage the toilet. Then you can cover the Johnny bolt using the decorative cap that comes with the toilet. Next, slowly open the fill valve and observe the tank as it fills with water to make sure that there are no leaks near the bolts. After the tank is full, you can give it a test by flushing it, and you want to make sure at this point that there's no leaks on the underside of the toilet on both sides. We're good on that side, and we're also good on the other side, which is good news. At this point, you can put on the tank cover and you can install an escutcheon where the supply line comes through the wall. Next up, you'll need to install the toilet seat, which is relatively straightforward. And finally, you can caulk the bottom of the toilet if you want. Some people choose not to do that, so the choice is yours. All right, let's take a look at the final result. Alright guys, that is a wrap on this video. If it helped you out, I really would appreciate if you could drop a like down below and subscribe to the channel if you want to see how I did the rest of this basement bathroom. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to show you how to install a drop ceiling in a small basement bathroom. And this video is going to cover everything from installing the wall moldings to installing the ceiling grid. And then kind of at the end, we're going to install the drop ceiling panels and go over a few tips and tricks on the installation. Now, although this drop ceiling doesn't look nearly as good as the drop ceiling that I installed in my basement, it's still not bad, and it gives me access to the plumbing above and the electrical. So if that sounds good, let's get into step one and install the wall moldings. So the wall molding is essentially just an L bracket that we're going to mount to the wall, and that's going to support the drop ceiling around the perimeter of the room. Before we can hang the wall molding, we need to establish a level line across the entire perimeter of the room so that we have a reference line to actually hang the wall molding on. I used a laser level to mark my line, but you can also go old school and just use a tape measure and a level. The manufacturer recommends you give yourself a couple inches below the joists or any kind of obstructions above so you can actually position the wall panels, but the space in my bathroom was very limited, so I went as high as I could. Position the wall molding so that it's flush with the laser line or just level line that you established previously, and then you're going to attach it to each wall stud. I found that self-tapping metal screws work the best for this because the wall molding I used was made of metal. There are going to be multiple instances where you're going to need to trim the wall molding to length, and to do that, just use some tin snips. For the inside corners, the manufacturer recommends that you stagger the joint as shown in this figure, but for my installation, I found myself tucking one end into the other, which worked for me, but it's not exactly sanctioned by the manufacturer. For the outside corners, you're going to create a miter joint, which is going to be a 45 on each corner. So I held a piece of wall molding in place with some masking tape, and here I am just establishing that 45-degree angle, and then I'm going to cut that using tin snips, just like we did for the straight cuts. I recommend that you use a carpenter square to make sure that you get a perfect 45-degree angle, but the tin snips are going to make cutting it pretty easy, and here I am showing how they come together just for illustration purposes only. To attach the outside corner to the wall, position it on the level line, and then attach it to the studs using a self-tapping metal screw, making sure that the 45 degrees line up as they should. And now that you know how to install the inside corners and the outside corners, it's just a matter of going around the rest of the room, attaching the wall moldings to each stud as you go across, and just make sure that the wall molding is perfectly level and in line with your laser line as you go across the room. But overall, installing the wall molding is not rocket science. And once you have it installed around the entire perimeter of the room, we can move on to step 2, which is installing the ceiling grid. But before you start just installing the ceiling grid, we need to think a little bit about layout. If you're a little bit old school, you can use some graph paper and a calculator to map out your room grid, or you can use Armstrong Ceiling's online resource, which allows you to enter your room dimensions, enter the size of your panels, enter the ceiling joist direction, and it's going to calculate how many panels you're going to need, and it's also going to figure out the width of your border panels. It's pretty handy. Let's take a look at this example room, which is 132 inches by 104 inches. If we look at the horizontal run, you can see that we have room for 5 full 24-inch ceiling panels, which leaves us with 12 inches left over. You want to divide that by 2 so that you have an even border panel on both sides of the room. In this case, that gives us 6 inches. You can apply that same concept for the 104-inch dimension of the room, and that's going to give us 4 inches on each side for the border panels. For my basement, I spent a lot of time thinking about layout, but for this bathroom, it's literally like 4 or 5 tiles. It's so small. So I didn't really spend all that much time trying to make the stagger even. I just kind of put it up in place. So spend a little bit more time if you want it to look a little bit cleaner than this installation. Also, if you plan to install any kind of soundproofing insulation, you want to do that before you put in the ceiling grid, since that'll just get in the way. So on the perimeter of the room, the drop ceiling grid is going to be supported by the wall molding, but in the center of the room, the grid is supported by either hanger wire or quick hang hardware. Here's a look at the quick hang bracket, which attaches directly to the ceiling joist, and then we have our quick hang hook, which when we squeeze this together, we can slide it through like that, turn it over, and then when we squeeze the tabs here, we can adjust the height of the hook. Because the quick hang hardware is used to support the main beams, we need to position it so that it's either one border panel's length away from the wall or a border panel's length plus 24 inches, which is the size of one standard ceiling panel. For my basement drop ceiling installation, I needed to install 2 main beams, so I had to attach this quick hang hardware to the studs with 1 screw in the middle, and then you're going to bend the hanger wire out of the way if there's an obstruction at the top. After installing the quick hang hardware, it's time to prepare and hang the main beams. But not so fast. You can't just go install a full piece of main beam, because you need to trim the end of the main beam so that the cross T slot on the main beam is a border panel distance from the wall. This is going to give you the perfect size opening for the drop ceiling panel we're going to install later. So after determining how much of the main beam you need to cut off based on your grid layout, use tin snips to cut the top of the main beam first and then the bottom. This will give you a flat piece of beam that you're going to rest on top of the wall molding. Then you can support the main beam in the center by connecting it to the hanger wire clip and adjusting the height. But in this small bathroom, the total span was less than 4 feet, so I didn't even need to install hanger wire. But I did have to trim the main beam around this duct because I was really hurting for headroom. But after getting your main beam installed, you're going to take the cross tees and you're going to start assembling the grid. The openings in the main beam are 24 inches apart, so it's going to match up with a 24 by 24 inch ceiling panel, and then you're going to click each of the cross tees into the main beam. Next, you're going to want to square the grid to make sure that the diagonal measurements are the same, otherwise you might run into trouble down the road. For cross tees that need to be trimmed, I positioned it on top of the border panel and then marked it along the grid and then just cut it using tin snips before positioning them in place. Lastly, you want to make sure the grid is perfectly level, and a magnetic level makes this easy. Now that we have our wall molding and our ceiling grid in place, we can finally start installing the drop ceiling panels. Now, unlike other drop ceiling panels, these are made out of PVC, so they're not going to get all yellow and discolored at the first sign of water, and for that reason, I was comfortable installing these in my basement bathroom, where there's probably going to be a little bit of moisture from the shower, the sink, etc. And as I mentioned before, we only have a handful of ceiling tiles here, so most of them are getting a recessed light. So to mark the recessed light location, I used a template that came with the lights. I'll link those lights in the description, and then I cut out the penetration using a utility knife. It honestly cuts pretty easy, so don't stress. After using the spring tabs to position the light in place, here's how it looks, and then I'm gonna hook up the electrical, which is just a twist connection, which makes things easy, and then I position the panel in place by tilting it sideways, moving the grid out of the way as needed, and then making sure that the light was working. And then I repeated this process of marking the light location, cutting out the penetration using a utility knife, and then inserting the recessed light into the panel, and then actually putting the panel within the grid after hooking up the electrical. And after installing the only 2 full panels, yes, only 2 full panels in this one little room, it's time to measure the border panel. So I used my tape measure and transposed that measurement onto a new 24 inch by 24 inch drop ceiling panel, and then I used a level and a utility knife to cut the panel to size. Next is just a matter of installing the border panel within the grid, just like we did for the full panels, just to a smaller scale. Then you're going to repeat this process of cutting the border panels to the appropriate size and installing them within the grid. In the other part of the bathroom above the shower, we had 1 full panel with no lights, and then we had 2 panels with lights, and I also had to cut out this penetration for an exhaust fan, and I'll show you how to install a bathroom exhaust fan in the next video. After installing this last piece around the outside corner, let's talk about a few tips and tricks and reveal the final result. If I'm being perfectly honest, installing a drop ceiling is a little bit cumbersome, and you're gonna make a few mistakes. You're gonna cut something to the wrong size. You're gonna find out the main beam that you cut doesn't line up perfectly with the penetration for the cross tee. It's a little bit of trial and error, and I certainly had my fair share of errors, but once you get the hang of it, it is not too bad. Another tip would be don't install the old school mineral fiber drop ceiling panels in your basement. Those get nasty quick. If they have any water, they're gonna turn yellow and just fall to pieces. Go with PVC if you're gonna go with a drop ceiling. With all that said, let's take a look at the final result of my bathroom. Now, I know you guys hate it when I rip on my work, but let's be honest, this is not going to be in Better Homes and Gardens, but for a basement bathroom with a ceiling height of 6 foot 2 inches, this'll work. What's up everybody? In this video, I'm going to show you how to install an exhaust fan in a small basement bathroom, and this is going to include everything from drilling the penetration through your home to actually mounting the exhaust fan in the ceiling, and then we'll cover some final touches like installing the drop ceiling panel around it, etc. So if you need to install an exhaust fan in your basement bathroom, stay tuned. The first step in this exhaust fan project is to drill a hole through the foundation so we can take the exhaust duct from the inside of the house and route it to the exterior. Because we're in the basement, we're limited with the headroom, and just like the exhaust duct for the dryer and also the gas line supply coming in, we're limited, so we had to go through the foundation, and we're just going to match that for this exhaust fan. If you have the option to go higher up through the band joist or through your home siding instead of the foundation, probably a better idea. Because we're going to be installing a 4-inch exhaust fan duct, I picked up this 4.25-inch drill bit on Amazon. I'll link it down in the video description so you can see exactly what I got, but I also needed a threaded adapter that would then connect to my SDS connection on my rigid hammer drill. I'll link all this in the description. This is what I used. And obviously, before we can drill through the foundation, we gotta hook up our adapter, connect it to our hammer drill, and we want the hammer drill on hammer function when drilling through masonry, like cinder blocks. When deciding on where to actually drill through the cinder block foundation, you wanna take a look at other penetrations to see where the cavities are in the cinder block. Basically, a cinder block has a structural center and there's 2 void spaces on either side. You wanna drill through a void space, not the structural element. So pay attention to that. So I used the existing dryer vent exhaust penetration as a guide to determine where the hollow point in the cinder block was going to be, and then I used that hose bib as a reference to mark the center of the hole that I'm going to drill for my new exhaust fan penetration. I took that mark on the inside and moved it to the outside since I figured drilling on the outside was going to be easier. But here I ran into my first problem. So to save a couple bucks, I bought this core drill bit that did not come with a pilot bit that goes down the center, and a pilot bit is going to make it very easy to keep your drill bit steady. But since we didn't have one, we had to create this jig just to set the initial drill location to keep the bit from wandering all over the place. Once we had the initial circle outline in place, it was easy to go back in and do the rest of the drilling. If you have a good hammer drill, drilling through this cinder block is going to be no problem at all as long as you're on hammer function and you hold the drill nice and level. It should go through pretty easy. As you can see here, we made it through the first wall of the cinder block and there's the empty cavity, and here we are drilling through the other side. Nice. So now that we have a 4.25 inch hole in our foundation, let's take a look at this exhaust fan. Okay, so we're installing this this kit right here. It comes with the vent, comes with the duct, and then it has some flexible duct here. So first things first, I assembled the 4-inch HVAC duct, and then I inserted that into the plastic hood, which is going to attach to the exterior of our home. Then you're going to take some HVAC tape just to seal up all the connections, make sure that no air is going to escape, and once you've taped everything up, it's time to thread it through the house. Okay, so here's what we got on the inside. You can see we got a nice view to the exterior, and now we're going to go ahead and install this. Okay, so at this point we have our assembled piece right here. We taped it all together. Now we're just gonna go ahead and insert it all the way through till it's nice and flush. After positioning the hood vent in place and making sure it was level, I marked the 4 locations for the screws, and after marking all of those with a Sharpie, I removed the hood vent so I could pre-drill using a hammer drill again. Since we're going to be drilling into cinder block, I'm using a carbide tip masonry bit with my smaller hammer drill, and the diameter of that carbide tip bit is going to depend on the size of Tapcon masonry screws you're using to secure your exhaust fan hood to the house. I'll link the ones that I use down in the video description. Now it's just a matter of screwing all 4 of those Tapcon screws through the exhaust fan hood and into the cinder block. After securing the hood, I took some clear silicone and I went around the perimeter of the vent hood just to make it completely weather tight. After weatherproofing the exterior of that hood, I went on the inside and applied some expanding spray foam insulation just to seal up that penetration. For this exhaust fan, I'm using 4-inch flexible duct, and there's no debate that rigid duct is a better bet, but the kit I purchased came with flexible, so that's what we're using. I'm going to be installing this Hampton Bay exhaust fan, and it comes with this air flap that will stay closed when the fan is not in use and then will open up when the fan kicks on. This will help to prevent cold air from the exterior from making its way into the house. Then on the other side of the fan, we have our electrical connections, and then on the bottom side, obviously, we have the actual fan. At this point, it's time to actually mount the exhaust fan, and we're going to be installing it directly onto that floor joist above. So what I'm doing is I'm holding it in place, and because I'm using a drop ceiling, it's going to extend a little bit further down than the joist, but if you were going to be drywalling the ceiling, you would want it perfectly flush with the joist so that it doesn't interfere with that drywall. For this particular exhaust fan, there are 2 set screws that I'm installing, and then you're basically going to hang the exhaust fan on those 2 screws by the brackets that are attached to the exhaust fan. Now, I ran the electrical cable over to the exhaust fan as part of my LED bathroom mirror video, which I'll link down below, and after confirming that the breaker was off using my voltage tester, it's time to hook everything up. Alright, so it's pretty hard to show this, but as you can see, it's a push connection right there, push connection, so we have our neutral, we have our ground, and then I have not done the hot yet. So basically, I'll see if I can try to show this and slide it right on top there and then push it in. Wow, with one hand, can't believe that worked.
Now we have all three connected.
After hooking up all the electrical connections, I tucked the wires back into the junction box, and then I took the discharge on the 4-inch flexible duct and I attached that to the discharge, which is going to connect to the exhaust fan that has that air flap valve that I showed you previously. After securing the connection with aluminum foil tape, it's time to actually make the connection to the exhaust fan. There are plastic clips that clip it into place pretty easily, but I installed a piece of aluminum foil tape on one side since there seemed to be a little bit of airflow escaping. And after hooking that up, I gave the exhaust fan a test to make sure it was working.
Now let's follow this to the other side. Okay, so obviously I gotta work out all this slack and kinks, but here we are following it around to the other end, and we can see that it's working because we have this nasty dryer sheet. We'll bring that close to it and you'll see that'll blow right across. So the last thing we have to do is trim this to size and hook it up to our exhaust. So here I am, just gonna pull out this slack here. All right, so what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna trim this to length. So as you can see, we gotta go there. I'm gonna give this a little extra play, but I'll go ahead and cut it right here.
And after using a utility knife and then tin snips to cut through the actual rigid wire that holds the duct together, I slipped it over the rigid piece of ducting that went through the house, and then I used aluminum foil tape to make sure that connection wasn't going anywhere. And if we have any HVAC guys watching this video, I'd be curious to hear down in the comments if there's any regulations on flexible duct versus rigid, how often you have to secure it to the joist, if you can have bends like this. I'm not entirely sure, so please let me know down in the comments. At this point, the installation is almost complete. We just have to measure out the penetration that we're going to need to cut in our drop ceiling so it can go around the exhaust fan. So I made the measurements and I created this little template box that was the same size as the exhaust fan, and then I used that as a template to cut around the drop ceiling panel that we're going to be installing around the exhaust fan. And after I finally figured out the correct orientation to actually install this drop ceiling panel, we got it positioned and put into place around the exhaust fan. And the last step in this project is we need to install the grill, and to do that, you're gonna pinch these two tabs together, and those are gonna slide up right into the slots on either side of the exhaust fan, and it's gonna pull it flush with the drop ceiling or the drywall. And that's how you install an exhaust fan. I recently added a bathroom to my basement completely from scratch, and in this video I'm going to show you how to install the vanity and hook up the sink/faucet. This video is going to cover every aspect of the project from start to finish, so let's get started. For this project, we're going to be installing a 36-inch vanity and this Delta Portwood faucet. You're also going to need a P-trap, an extension tube possibly, some silicone, your trap adapter right here, and then your supply hoses to feed the faucet. Here's a look at all those materials, and I'll link them down below in the description. If we were to rewind a couple videos, you can see that the plumber already installed the drain piping for the vanity and the sink. That's 2-inch PVC, and after drywalling and installing the 1/2-inch CPVC supply piping, we're now ready to install this vanity in place. For step one in this project, we're going to turn off the water supply to the bathroom, and we're going to cut off the 1/2-inch CPVC caps so that we can install the valves that are going to supply the faucet. I cut these off using a hacksaw, then I deburred the inside of the cut. Next, we're going to grab our CPVC primer and glue, prime the outside of the CPVC pipe, then I applied a bit of glue before putting this 1/2-inch CPVC angle valve over top of the pipe, giving it a half turn and holding it in place for around 20 seconds. Then I repeated this exact same process of priming, gluing, and pushing the valve in place for the hot water supply. Next up, we can begin installing the faucet handles, and to do that, we're going to push the handle down through the vanity, and on the underside, we're going to secure it in place using this washer and this lock screw nut. Make sure that you install the right handle on the right side so that it obviously turns on towards you. Before permanently installing the faucet handle, put some silicone on the underside, or you can put it just directly on the vanity and then push the handle into place, making sure it's positioned where you want it. Repeat this for both the hot and the cold water handles. After working on the top side, we're going to go underneath, install that washer and the lock screw just like I showed you before. When it comes to installing the faucet, you're going to take the faucet and put it down through the vanity just like we did for the handles, except we're going to secure this in place on the underside using this bracket plate. To secure and tighten the plate, you're going to install this lock nut, and it comes with a tool so that you can easily access it from underneath the vanity. Just like with the sink handles, we're going to apply a bit of silicone to the underside and position the faucet in place before going on the underside, taking our bracket, positioning it in place, and then tightening up the lock nut with the provided tool, just like I showed you outside. And if you have any excess silicone on top of the vanity, clean it up before it dries. To connect the spout to the handles, we're going to use this quick connect supply hose that came with the faucet, and you're basically just going to push it into place until you hear a click, and then do that for the handle, again pushing it up into place until you hear a click, and then again for the other side. You want to pull down lightly just to make sure that you made the connection properly and it won't come undone. Now, I've been showing how to hook up everything from underneath because I know some people are not going to have the ability to kind of remove the vanity top or have a second set of hands to help them with that. But if you do have the ability to remove the vanity and just work on the sink kind of separately, it's going to be so much easier to access everything and tighten everything up. So for illustration purposes, I pulled this off, and here's a look at everything hooked up where you can see it plainly. So here's a look at everything underneath. So here is here's our main faucet coming down. We had our connection here. You can see it went to one branch on this side, which we threaded on, one branch on that side. Now we have our supply lines, which is this 1/2 inch, which goes up there, and then we have our 3/8 inch, which is going to connect to the valves. Same thing on the other side. Here's a quick zoom out. That's it. And before hooking up your supply hoses, it's always a good rule of thumb to flush out the lines just to make sure there's no dirt or debris that's going to make their way up into your new faucet and foul it up. That was me flushing the line for the toilet supply, and I have a video for that if you want to see how I installed the basement toilet. Now at this point, it was time to grab the vanity and actually install it in its permanent location within the bathroom, and thankfully I had some help getting that in place because it was pretty heavy, and then we just pushed it back into that alcove. Although you can secure the vanity to the studs using some screws, I skipped this step, and then we grabbed the vanity top, lifted it up over the base, and then positioned and placed it on top of the vanity bottom. And since we flushed the lines in the previous step, I'm hooking up the supply line for the hot and cold handle, and then I'm going to connect that to our angle valves below. And once we finish up with the supply lines, we can install the tailpipe assembly and drain. To install the drain flange that goes on top of the sink, you're going to first apply silicone or plumber's putty to the underside. Then you're going to take the drain assembly, which is going to screw into the flange. So position it in place, push the putty down into the sink, tighten everything up, and thread that on. And after hand tightening the top, you can apply another bead of silicone just to make sure that you're not going to have any leaks. Then head to the underside and tighten the lock nut to make sure that the drain flange assembly is secured tightly. I took a screenshot of the schematic so you could get a better look at what's going on with that drain assembly since mine came pre-assembled. And there's a rod on the back side of the spout which adjusts the stopper. And you want to find which penetration on the vertical rod is going to work best for your stopper. Once you find that, take the horizontal rod, run it through the perforation, and use that clip to hold it in place. Next up, it's time to install the P-trap assembly, and I first took a small 1.5 inch spool piece to get me out of the wall a bit. Then I'm going to take this 1.5 inch coupling, which is going to connect to the 1.5 inch adapter, which is going to receive the trap arm in the next step. So before going underneath the sink, I glued everything up with primer and PVC glue beforehand to get that apparatus all assembled, and then obviously held it in place for around 20 seconds to make sure it was secure. Then I went on the underside, applied primer to the inside of that 90, and then I pushed my assembly into place. Now that we know where our P-trap assembly is going to rest, take the trap arm and see how much you're going to need to cut off so it matches up with the drain piece assembly. You can use a hacksaw to cut it, a miter saw, or a reciprocating saw. Just make sure that you deburr all of the cut rough edges of PVC. Next, grab the trap arm, and this is going to be assembled together using a series of slip nuts and slip washers. As you can see, you want the flared end of the slip washer to be facing the connection point, and then you're going to tighten it up using the slip nut. I pre-attached the trap bend to the trap arm before assembling, but if you want to install it separately, just install the trap arm, slide up an additional slip nut, and then attach it to the trap bend, threading on the slip joint just like before. To make the connection to the drain tailpiece, you're going to slide up a slip nut and then a slip washer onto the tailpiece, and you're also going to need a slip nut and washer for the 6-inch extension tube we needed for this project. Gently push the extension tube down into the trap bend until you're able to slip it over the tailpiece, and once you're happy with how everything is lining up and assembled, go ahead and tighten up the slip nuts. It's quite possible that you won't need an extension tube for your project, but for this one I did, and I figured I'd show how to install it. Now, if you remember, this vanity is installed in this small alcove with 3 walls around it, so I can't just install the one backsplash that came with this vanity at the back, because water's obviously going to overflow the sides as well. So to remedy this, I tossed away the backsplash that came with the vanity, and I went to Home Depot, and I picked up this smaller stone surround that I then cut to size using an angle grinder with the hopes of installing that around all 3 sides of the vanity. After marking and cutting the stone surround to the required length, I then took a bead of silicone and ran it on top of the vanity so that when I pushed this surround down into it, it would help to hold it in place permanently and also give me a second level of defense against water leaking underneath it. Then I installed a piece of backsplash at the back of the vanity before caulking between the backsplash and the wall, and then I caulked between the backsplash vertical piece and the vanity horizontal surface. This is the same caulking you would do for any backsplash and vanity installation, and then I cleaned up the caulk line using a caulking tool, but a wet finger will also work. Finally, give the sink a test, make sure the water is functioning properly with hot and cold, and make sure you don't have any leaks on the underside. Now, you can enjoy your new vanity and faucet. This video is going to show you how to complete every step in the accordion folding door installation process, including trimming the door, installing all the hardware, and getting it actually mounted in your opening. If you watch this all the way through, it's the only video you'll need. With that said, let's get into the video. I'm installing a bathroom in my basement, which has a furnace right next to it. So I decided to use an accordion folding door, which was an easy way to allow for access and still cover up the furnace. To determine what size door you're going to need to order, go ahead and measure your rough opening, measure the height in a couple locations to make sure it's uniform, and also the width of your opening. In my case, I was about 70 inches by 34 inches. As a result, I ordered an 80-inch high by 36-inch wide door, which I'm going to trim down to my dimensions in the next step. To trim down your door, start at the top, which is going to have your mounting holes. What I did is I basically measured 70 inches, which is my opening, and then I determined the additional height that was introduced by the top rail and the bracket right there, which was about 1¼ inches. Therefore, after subtracting that, I got my dimension where I needed to cut, and I put painter's tape to hold all of the panels together, and then I simply marked where I was going to cut on that painter's tape line. Check out my blog article, which I'll link in the description, for more info on making your cut. Then I took some blocks and I used a hacksaw to go ahead and cut right through the accordion door panels, as you're seeing. After you cut all the way through, take off the painter's tape on the top end, and you're not going to need the bottom, so get rid of that. Next, take your top rail, and you're going to want to cut that 1/8 of an inch shorter than the top of your opening, again, using a hacksaw. Now, what I did here is I took a tape measure to establish a uniform line from the front. I think I measured 1.5 inches off of that front face, and I marked that in a few places across the top so that I had a nice line established for where I was going to attach that mounting rail. The mounting rail or top rail has these pre-drilled holes, and what you're going to do is take your hardware that was supplied, use one of these 3/4 inch screws, and then what you're going to do is you're going to find the pre-drilled hole closest to the center of your opening, and then just insert one screw, not fully tightening at this stage. Next, let's head over to our door and install these circular glide rings. These are going to fit around the perforated holes, and they're going to snap into place, putting one end on the top and then snapping into place, coming in on the other side. So as you can see, we're putting the one end on the top there and then bringing the other piece on the other side until it snaps into place. Be sure to keep these the same orientation, meaning the same side on the top and the same side on the bottom for all of these perforated holes. And then you're going to take your slide brackets and you're going to go ahead and snap those into place for each of the previously installed slide rings. So again, these snap into place. You're going to have to use your fingers, maybe a little bit of your nails to actually pry these open. It was kind of tough in a couple of them, but just snap all of those into place. The end panel of the door is going to receive this T-shaped glide, and you're going to take that, put it through the middle, and then insert a screw through the top there, and then head over on the other side, and you're going to anchor that into place. This is just a threaded connection, and use a screwdriver to tighten everything up and get that glide perfectly installed. Here is a quick look of me tightening, and then we'll show you what it looks like on the inside. So at this point, let's install the door handle. The hardware came with black and white accent colors. I went with white since it was a little more subtle. And then there's going to be these push pins that you're going to insert into one side of the door handle, push the handle through the perforations, and then take the other side of the handle and insert the push pins until it is fully secure. At this point, take your top rack, angle it out so you can take your glide brackets and glide rings and slide them into the top rack as you're seeing now. Do this for all the panels, and then kind of tilt it back into place. As I'm showing here, those kind of slide into place, they go into the top rack, and they rest once they've gone through in that direction. Then, go ahead and pivot the top rack back into place, put the top rack in line with the marks you established previously, and then finish anchoring through all of the pre-drilled perforations in the top rack. And here I just slid the panels to the other side so I could go through and get access to anchor the top rack on the opposite side of the rack. Now, just gave it just a quick test to make sure everything was looking good so far. Next, go to the non-opening side of your opening, and there's an anchor panel that is attached to the door. What you're gonna do is you're gonna secure that anchor panel to the wall with your 3/4 inch anchoring screws, and you're gonna do this on the top, bottom, and middle, and do this on both sides of the door. I could only show one side here, but the other side was done as well. Finally, on the closing side of your door, there is a magnetic latch plate that you're gonna install to keep the door closed when it's in the closed position. So use a piece of tape after establishing where that door is gonna hit on that wall, and then you're gonna secure that latch plate with the 3/4 inch anchoring screws that came with your kit. Give it a couple tests and you should hear a nice audible magnetic click when it's done properly. Nice. At this point, the accordion folding door installation is complete. Give your door a couple tests to make sure everything lines up perfectly, and if you haven't done so already, please drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you like DIY content. And at this point, we're at the home stretch of this basement bathroom edition, and all that's left to do is install the tub spout, install the shower head, install the trim kit for the shower valve, and after tightening that up, you're gonna install the handle, and then you're gonna caulk the top and sides of the shower valve. Leave the bottom open so any trapped moisture can escape. Then, go back and caulk the tub surround as required, and if you're not great with caulking, you can use the old tape trick. All right, y'all, let's take a quick reminder look at where this project started. And here's a look at the final result. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like down below. It helps me out with the algorithm. And subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell if you like this type of DIY content. Finally, as a reminder, I have a free ebook down below that has every material that I installed in this bathroom listed, and also gives you a cost breakdown so you know how much to budget for your basement bathroom edition. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to seeing y'all on the next one. Thanks.